So in the last part of this lecture, we had looked at the work of Robert Maillard, both warehouse and factory designer, but more famously a bridge designer, and left it talking about how Maillard had seen concrete not only as a structural solution, but also as an aesthetic inspiration, that concrete would allow the more direct kind of expression of structural principles, very much in the way that Elsner had talked about the skyscraper problem, that being able to see the actual material of the concrete would lead to naturally more kind of honest or truer expressions of a structure. In this last part of the lecture, I want to look at a very, very different philosophy about concrete, put forth by this group of brothers, and particularly the one in the middle, Auguste Perret. The Perret brothers were part of a family firm, so very much in the Raincy tradition of a family of first artificial stonemakers, first stonemakers. Their father had been a stonemason, and in the kind of political upheaval of the 1870s, had settled in Brussels and then come back to Paris a decade later. He founded a building company called Enterprise Perret et Fils, the Perret and Sons, basically. And after the retirement and death of the father, this emerged into the brothers Perret. And they referred to their company as architects, constructeurs or builders, and interestingly, béton armé, which is French for reinforced concrete. So they were specialists, they were claiming in design, in building, but also in this one particular material. Now, crucially, two of the brothers, including Auguste, who will be the kind of lead figure in the company going forward, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. So they had this very, very classical training, and particularly under this one figure, Julien Gaudet, who was an exponent of what he termed classical rationalism, that classicism came out of a kind of rational understanding of the program, and that the program and the language all sort of determined the details that followed. A very, very French way of thinking about design, but also a continental philosophy-based idea, right? That the idea determines the details. After Auguste received his diploma, he came back to the firm, came back to the family firm, and first proposed using this new kind of wonder material of reinforced concrete in a project they did for a casino on the French coast in 1898. And his philosophy, I think, overall, we'll talk a lot about Auguste's philosophy, but he really argued for a combination of construction and design, that the architect, he says, isn't just an artist, a dreamer of form. He actually has to go out and build, construct, achieve, right? The lines of a project, and here we might remember Alberti's idea about lineaments of architecture versus the body of architecture. And Auguste says that one mind ought to be thinking of both of those. Here is Auguste Perret's sort of thesis project at the Beaux-Arts, and you can see that from the start, he's going to have a very different approach than Robert Maillard, who's coming from a pure engineering standpoint. The Perrets have architectural ambitions that come right out of the French neoclassical tradition. And their early work in concrete shows exactly this, that the concrete basically is largely hidden behind limestone facades. Their father, remember, is a stonemason, so they have access to skilled labor when it comes to cutting limestone, both knowledge of kind of local quarries, but also what can be done with it. And so in their early projects, we see French apartment buildings, Parisian apartment buildings that, even though they're structured with this new material, are clad in a very traditional stone skin. So to Elsner's point about the skyscraper, we're not seeing the structural material here. We're seeing the concrete is basically in service of a very traditional way of thinking about facades. That changes a bit when they get a commission for this apartment block on the Rue Franklin, just across the river from Eiffel's Tower. And here, Auguste Perret begins to think about how the structure of the building, the material that goes into the building, might change the way you think about the expression of the building. And it's not a huge leap, but Perret gets interested in the fact that reinforced concrete can be much slenderer than stone when you're thinking of piers. It wants to be a sort of flat slab, especially in apartment designs. And the exterior expression of this apartment block start to get at that. The concrete is still concealed, but it's concealed now behind tile that very clearly isn't structure, right? The stone detailing on the earlier projects makes it look as though it's a stone building. And when you look at the tile work that's going on here, it's clearly ornamental. The tile is not what's holding up the building. And he talks later about this being a kind of key moment, that he says that yes, they wanted to express the proportions of the building, if not the actual material, revealing the framework. And the reason for the cladding, he says, is that they were nervous about the vulnerability of the reinforcing to moisture, that the concrete being porous might let moisture in. So what you're looking at when you look at the tile on Rue Franklin, he says it's basically an environmental coating. Frombe stoneware, which he thought was an appropriate material. And he says that what they had started to do, though, was to think about how those patterns could differentiate between the kind of supporting members, the spanning members, and the infill members. And that is pretty clear from the window detail, where you can see that the columns are emphasized with kind of vertical fluting. You might think of the Reliance building or some of the terracotta skyscraper cladding in Chicago. The window infill is framed in this floral decoration that very clearly has nothing to do with structure. It's just enclosure, right? Just keeping out the rain. The really radical thing about the Rue Franklin block, though, was its structure. That Perret realized that because the concrete columns could be placed anywhere in the plan, they all have to line up vertically, but you can put those columns kind of anywhere you want, that you could open up the planning of the apartment block to whatever the program wanted. You weren't locked into the sort of modularity of steel construction. You weren't locked into the kind of big, thick walls of stone and masonry construction. This was really a way to get at the skeleton. And you can see that in Paris, with the experience of Onnabeek, with Perret's own experience in reinforced concrete, there's a much, much more liberal attitude toward the size of those columns compared with, say, the Ingalls building, which is just about the same time. So Perret is interested in the expression of concrete as a structural material, but he's interested much more in the frame than he is in the kind of curvilinear constructions that Maillard thinks show off how the material works in spanning. And you begin to see Perret realizing that the frame and his classical background have some resonance. Here, a garage, so another automotive-inspired building in the early 20th century that has a very kind of Beaux-Arts facade. It's a very stripped-down Beaux-Arts facade, but it's very classical, hierarchy, right? There's more emphasis on the center. There's more emphasis on the big columns that come out to the foreground versus the horizontals that get kind of pushed backwards. And there's this very nice cornice across the top. All of it very stripped down, but all of it clearly looking at classical precedents rather than at something more kind of radical. One of the most important moments in the Perret's career comes when they're asked to basically first be the contractor for a very large theater project on the Champs-Elysees. It's designed by Henri van de Velde, who's a Belgian architect, sort of an Art Nouveau architect, and he hires, or the Perret brothers are hired basically to build his scheme. And Van de Velde is very interested in the kind of arts and crafts and combining traditional stonework with new materials. And really, he works initially very successfully with the Perrets to come up with ways to bridge this large theater, to bridge the stage house, and yet to have all of that kind of meet the street in a very kind of classical, but also sort of arts and crafts, very highly ornamented stone facade. And if you look, this is Perret's drawing here on the right. you can see that the grid, the structural grid, is combined with all sorts of arches and cantilevers and trusses that allow for balcony seating, that allow for long spans over the theater, and that allow for this huge volume of the fly tower behind. Perret, though, eventually starts to bristle at the decoration that Van de Velde is plastering over the front of his beautiful concrete. And he goes to the client and basically says that Van de Velde is ignoring the structure, hiding it, confusing our pylons, he says, a great line. And so Perret, in a way that probably isn't entirely ethical professionally, goes to the client and says, your architect is making you spend too much. You're building two buildings. You're building our building in reinforced concrete, and you're building another that's covered in junk, right? Covered in this stone frippery that Van de Velde is using to hide the structure. You'll spend on that second theater, the Van de Velde cladding, a lot more than what you're saving through our clever solution. And in fact, you could just use the concrete, right? Just express the concrete and save all of this money, right? You could spend it on making a better theater. And what he proposes is to essentially build most of Van de Velde's design, but to do it without hiding the concrete so much. So on the right, on the top, you can see what Van de Velde is proposing, these kind of stone panels that are cladding the very, very thin concrete structure. And on the bottom right, you can see what Perret proposes, which is that where the concrete can daylight, you let the concrete be the expression, the ornament. You fill it in sort of just enough to keep people from falling out of the windows. And that is, in large part, what ends up being built. There are elements that are clad with stone, but particularly on the interior, Perret wins, and the interior finishes of the theater and many of the exterior finishes are actually in expressed concrete. You're actually seeing the material that's doing the job. True to say that a lot of the concrete engineering that Perret had done for Van de Velde lives on in the theater. So the cantilevered balconies, they get rid of supports at the front that would block views. But also, as you can see on the right, a real interest in reinterpreting the idea of classical architecture, trabeated architecture, columns and beams, but taking advantage of the much larger spans, the much skinnier elements that reinforced concrete allows. A kind of classical language that's reinterpreted through the material qualities. The most sort of stunning example of this is a church commission that Perret gets after World War I that's designed to honor the taxi drivers of this town of Raincy, who drove soldiers to the front in World War I, many of whom died as a result. So it's a very, very sacred, very meaningful, sort of culturally resonant building in this Paris suburb. And Perret is hired and does something very radical, which is to say that instead of building a concrete structure with all of the kind of traditional neo-Gothic stone ornament that would be plastered on it, Perret thinks that the concrete itself can speak to this very, very meaningful, very, very resonant moment. Notre Dame de Raincy is often thought of as the kind of paradigm of what Ken Frampton has called the Greco-Gothic, the idea that you marry sort of classical forms with a Gothic emphasis on light and skeletal structures and space. And it does this in a number of ways. It, first of all, does adopt a kind of Gothic plan. It's a relatively small church, but you can see it has a nave. It has an altar and a sort of choir space. It has an apse. It has an ambulatory. It has a narthex. And, of course, it has a tower. The planning of it, though, is all very pristine, all very geometrical, right? So it borrows also from the sort of classical sense of rhythm. And we've seen before that there's an overlap between classical planning and Gothic planning. Where it's really kind of at its most Gothic, though, is in its proportions and in its use of skeletal structure to bring light into the space. Perret doesn't need flying buttresses because the steel within concrete can handle the thrusts of even a very shallow arch. The nave is designed as a very shallow barrel vault that is supported on both sides by cross vaults that are also barrel vaults. So think maybe of the Basilica of Maxentius. But now instead of all of that mass holding it up, what Perret is relying on is the relative lightness of reinforced concrete and the ability of steel to handle a lot of the thrusts and the bending that would otherwise have to be taken up with pointed arches and flying buttresses. You can see throughout that the concrete is completely expressed. Nothing is hidden. It's what today we would call as struck. So the formwork comes off, and Perret is fine with you seeing all of the marks of the wooden formwork that were there. And in the spaces on the exterior, Perret designs this very, very intricate concrete and stained glass window system. It's often called the sort of Sainte-Chapelle of the modern movement, that all of this stained glass brings in all of this colored light. The stained glass is no longer kind of representative. It's not telling Bible stories. It's geometrical, abstract, very, very modern. And it's a church that really shows the potential of concrete to reach the kind of culturally meaningful heights that neoclassical or Gothic architecture maybe had, but also to define really new sort of structural experiences. Very, very thin columns, relatively solid roof vaults that are nevertheless thin and fairly light, and a really dramatic opening up of the exterior walls into window screens. Perret's apartment work, though, continues to be, to our eyes, relatively conservative, right? If Notre Dame de Raincy is a sort of combining of classical and Gothic planning with the material potential of concrete, the apartment blocks that are really the firm's bread and butter continue to be sort of Beaux-Arts inspired, very sort of neoclassical in their massing, and to some extent in their ornament as well. You can see that they've moved from very kind of fine, almost handmade ornament to ornament that comes out of the wooden formwork itself. But that's all proportioned in a way that reminds us of the classical language. So very often symmetrical, hierarchical. Here you can see that there's a cornice right where it should be if those lower 6 floors are a classical facade. And when you look at the details, you can see that there are hierarchies, right? Columns and beams and girders are pushed either in or out to reflect horizontality or verticality. It's only on the interior where you get these kind of poetic moments. So a very Baroque staircase that's in the main lobby of this particular building. And you can see in form only, right? When you see the actual surfaces, you're looking at the raw concrete, the exposed aggregate, very much like the Onnabeek apartment block that we looked at in the first part of this lecture. And Perret is sort of taken to task about the aesthetics of these apartment blocks by a number of critics, including Paul Valéry, who's an art critic of the time. And Valéry says, look, you have this fluid material. Look at what Garnier proposed to do with it. Look at what Maillard has done with it. Why is the curve so limited, right? Why do you not use the curve more in the walls of your buildings, in the forms of your buildings? Why is it limited to just these stairs? And Perret really encapsulates, I think, his whole philosophy, right, of trying to find classical expressions for concrete. He says, yes, concrete is a paste, but it's a paste that has to be shaped in molds, right? The molds are made of wood, and the way that we make wood that goes into formwork, we saw it, we put it on lathes. It's always a kind of linear production. And those lines of timber relate to the kind of mythology of ancient architecture, right? Perret falls for the idea that ancient architecture imitated wood. We've seen Viollet-le-Duc didn't agree with this, but remember, Perret is from the Beaux-Arts tradition, right? Not from Viollet-le-Duc's alternative tradition. So he sees timber as the link between classicism and concrete. Curved forms are costly. So you have to put a lot of effort into making the forms for one of those curved stairs. And he says it's the economy which determines style. So naturally, he says, because we're using timber forms, because timber has this link with the classical language, concrete really wants to be a classical material. It wants to be deployed in neoclassical forms. And in the late work, you see this, Perret in sort of his older age gets more and more conservative, and his concrete structures get more and more Beaux-Arts in their planning, but also in their detailing. Here, the Museum of Public Works, very much a Beaux-Arts plan. And then when you look at the details, you see that, yes, that is actually a colonnade around the outside that's done to attenuated proportions, right? Those are well beyond even a Corinthian column in their skinny proportions, but all the pieces of the classical language are there. The columns, column capitals, the entablature across the top, the pilasters that frame the openings at the base. All of those are borrowed from the Beaux-Arts. They're interpreted now in this new material, but the elements are all definitely there. When you get inside, you see columns that are Perret's interpretation of the column orders. Interestingly, they taper toward the base instead of toward the top. That is Perret's sort of concession to the modern nature of the material. But even when he does curves, you end up with stairs that are based on Baroque precedents, right? That are based on traditional classical or vaguely classical ideas. And I would argue that just passing by the Museum of Public Works, you could be convinced, if you didn't look closely, that it was an 18th century French neoclassical building. The column spacing is a little bit wider than stone, but we've seen as far back as Perrault's front for the Louvre that spacing can be based on iron proportions in addition to stone. The columns all have capitals, like good classical columns. You can see that in the entablature and at the cornice, there are even dentils, right? The little teeth that emphasize the horizontal stretch of the colonnade. And the way that he presents this building, I think you can look at sections like the one on the right and see in all of the details, all of the pieces, a kind of reinterpretation of the classical language that's been published since Vitruvius, right? All of the little parts, all of the pieces have to be there. They have to be there for Perret too. They can just be different proportions based on the material. It's a slightly complicated legacy. Perret certainly pushed the engineering potential for concrete with buildings like Notre Dame de Raincy. Not just the structural technology, but also the placement technology, how you do better and better formwork, better and better finishes. The frame is certainly a legitimate expression of concrete, right? We put concrete in boxes of formwork. We still like to have rectilinear planning. And therefore, even though it was controversial and seems very aesthetically conservative, Perret's not wrong. The concrete lends itself to trabeation, beams and columns, and that's a very convenient way to meet an awful lot of programmatic needs. Perret, of course, sees this link between classicism and modern forms. I think that's something that in the post-World War II era comes to be much more popular. Perret is seen as a very kind of conservative figure because of this, though, in the 20s and 30s. And I think his unwillingness to sort of clad his concrete with applied decoration is very much in line with the growing philosophy of kind of honesty in construction. Yes, his buildings are full of ornament that can be related to classicism, but notice that it's all made out of concrete, right? The idea of Van de Velde is that you take this beautiful concrete frame and you clad it with stonework disappears. And Perret thinks that ornament is important, but the ornament has to come out of the material itself. And then finally, Perret's greatest legacy maybe was his office. A whole generation of architects, including Le Corbusier, who would work in concrete during the 30s and 40s and 50s, came out of that office and really developed their knowledge of concrete, their ability to design in concrete through Perret and the work that his office did. I think you can see a lot of Corbusier's work in concrete as a kind of rebellion against the sort of father figure of Perret. Now, Perret and Maillard and Freycinet and these people weren't the only folks working in concrete. The idea of this brand new material that has all of these formal potentials shows up everywhere. So it shows up in Chicago, where Frank Lloyd Wright in 1904 does a very, very early building in reinforced concrete at Unity Temple, taking full advantage of both the structural potential, but also understanding very early in concrete's life or useful life, how you can get ornament out of the formwork that molds it. The maybe opposite end of the spectrum, this is a factory in Lingotto in Turin, Italy, by Mattei Trucco for Fiat. And Trucco builds the entire structure out of concrete. It's a multi-story building, so very much inspired by some of the multi-story factories that Henry Ford is building in America. But you can see that in addition to that frame that holds the manufacturing plant, after the cars are finished, they have to be tested. And so Trucco uses the ability of concrete to make curved forms into a test track on the roof, one of the most dramatic examples of concrete as a curving form. Concrete breaks all sorts of records. The Jahrhunderthalle in what's now Wroclaw in Poland by Max Berg and Hans Polzig breaks the record for span of a dome, right? This is finally the building that exceeds the Pantheon and does it in a really big way. And it uses concrete arches to do that. So concrete, reinforced concrete especially, has the potential to span much, much farther than any sort of masonry dome we've seen before. But it also has all sorts of aesthetic possibilities. And so if you are a kind of expressionist like Rudolf Steiner, you look at the fact that concrete can be formed in any sort of way you want, and you come up with this very Gothic in the modern sense, and this sort of haunting or spectral building, the Gotheaneum in 1923, where concrete's plasticity is used to create these very emotional spaces whose shapes don't really have much to do with the structural performance or with the way that the formwork is put together at all. And finally, maybe my favorite one, in 1934, a Russian emigre, Berthold Lubetkin, and his firm Tecton use concrete to create this really whimsical set of ramps for the penguin pool at London Zoo. And as kind of funny as they are, right, people crowd around the sides to see penguins walking up and down these ramps. It's a really difficult technical problem, and it relies on the capacity of an immense amount of steel reinforcing in there to get these cantilevered slopes to work. Finally, Corbusier is an important heir to both the Perret legacy, but also to a number of other thoughts about concrete. And when he designs in concrete for the first time, the early villas are often composed of concrete columns and floors, even though most of the walls are actually of brick and stucco. Corbusier understands, as Perret does, that concrete is good both at trabeation, in this case flat slabs and round columns, but it's also very good at these kind of poetic moments of curvature. So within the concrete frame of the Villa Savoie, you get this very dramatic staircase in the middle that I think you can relate directly to some of the tropes that the Perrets have, right? Classical exterior with this kind of moment of curving poetry inside. Corbusier is also a sort of concrete theorist, and his domino house proposal in the 1920s is both prescient in that it shows a kind of skeletal concrete frame with flat slab floors. It also shows the kind of limitations of how Corbusier understood the technology. The slabs in his early villas all have disguised beams and girders to help take the shear of the floors into the columns. In the pure domino house, Corbusier neglects the whole problem of punching shear, thinking that the architectural ideal is really just a pure column and a pure slab. And as we've seen from Maillart's work, even when it's just a pure slab, you need something to handle that punching shear. So even though the architecture and the engineering are certainly coming together, they're not quite there yet in Corbusier's work. Concrete will form a sort of constant to the rest of the course. It's both the most versatile material. It's been argued that concrete is the most important material of the 20th century, and I think that's probably a legitimate case to be made. Even in steel buildings, right? It shows up in things like floor slabs or in shear walls, and it becomes really an adjunct to the 19th century material of iron and steel. The 20th century becomes really an era where steel and concrete are almost always working together. And in this very short period of time, really from the kind of mid-19th century until the Ingalls building, we see a very rapid development that's really matched only by steel. And the two will go in lockstep for the rest of the course, defining kind of new ways of building both long spans and high rises.